Then welcome everybody to this first talk in the Human Evolution and the Paleolithic seminar series of 2025. And we're very pleased to welcome Teresa Steele here. And Teresa is a professor at the University of California, Davis in the Department of Anthropology. And her research focuses mostly on middle late Pleistocene in both Africa and Europe. So she's working a little bit on the Middle Stone Age, or modern humans producing Middle Stone Age, as well as Neanderthals producing the Middle Paleolithic in Europe. And she's a zooarchaeologist working mainly with bones and also, of course, shells and mollusks. And she's worked at various sites in especially Southern Africa, but also Morocco and southwestern France. And she might also be known to some of you as the one of the co-editors in chief of the Journal of Human Evolution. I know, sorry, Journal of Paleolithic Archaeology. And we had the other co-editor in December as our speaker. So a big welcome to you, Teresa, and we're all looking forward to your talk on the Middle Stone Age from Varsche Rivier 3, South Africa, Innovation, Environmental Variation, and Behavioral Diversity. Thank you again for getting up so early.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to come present to this group. As we were just saying before, it's a really nice opportunity to present to international colleagues that we don't always get to see as easily directly, and to share our work. So my pleasure to, yes, be up a little early, be professional a little early, and to provide more details about our work in South Africa. So as Philip introduced, I'll be speaking today about our recent research from the site of Varsche Rivier 3 and what we're learning about human innovation, how environmental variation might be playing a role in that innovation, how population isolation and connections, the role that those group dynamics have in innovation and are also related to environmental variation, and how that might be contributing to behavioral diversity in this key period of human evolution. So the period that we're talking about here, so as human paleontology and human genetics both point to Africa as a place where ancestors of all living people originated. We evolved there in the Middle and Late Pleistocene, and a subset spread from there about 60,000 years ago, eventually replacing other ancient hominins throughout the world. And that is all well and good to say that modern humans evolved in Africa. But as I always remind my undergraduates, Africa is a very large geographically, physically, and we know human genetically diverse place. And so there's a lot more work to be done about what's happening in Africa leading up to this expansion. So researchers are working on, from both genetic, human paleontological, and archaeological records. Where are we referring to when we talk about humans evolving in Africa? Is there a single ancestral population or multiple ancestral populations? What was the interaction between these populations? Again, both in terms of genetic connections, as well as sharing cultural innovations, cultural traits. Where in Africa can be divided up into multiple regions. What is the timing of these various evolutionarily significant phenomenon? And is there variation? Did all of this happen in Southern Africa, or what was the contributions to Eastern, Northern Africa, etc.? And this is where a lot of the conversation is going. And this figure that I've got up here, and we'll return to it at the very end, is an attempt by my colleagues and myself to really argue that we need to make more formal models about what we mean about what's happening in Africa, putting some geographical boundaries, some temporal boundaries on these population expansions and population connections. So this conversation tends to center the Middle Stone Age of Africa. It is a techno-complex or suite of stone tool industries that span from about 315 to 45,000 years ago. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, Africa is huge, with geographic and temporal variation in these stone tool industries. And it's within this time period that we start really seeing a lot of marked behavioral or technological stone tool diversity that seems to have regional or temporal signals. And so with that, we can argue for innovation in the archaeological record, not just in the stone tools, but as we'll see in other kinds of complex behaviors. We take this to maybe indicate cognitive complexity, symbolic thinking, language development, increased sociality. A lot of these behaviors that we think of as fundamentally human, or we start seeing traces of it within the Middle Stone Age. However, these behaviors appear sporadically. They appear regionally or have temporal markers. And so it's a little unclear exactly what the context is of when these behaviors are appearing and how they may or may not be transmitted across geographic regions of varying scales, which leads us to this question of what are the connections between different populations, and are there periods of isolation, and what is the significance of any periods of isolation as well? When looking at the Middle Stone Age, particularly of Southern Africa, a lot of focus has been given to these two industries highlighted here, the Howissens Port and Steele Bay, that are marked by distinct stone artifact crescents, like we can see with the Howissens Port, or segmented blades, in the Steele Bay, these bifacial points, as well as other non-lithic items that are associated with them, and we'll see those in a few slides. But these industries were initially noted and given these distinctive names because of their distinctive lithic technologies. Both of these industries span multiple ecological zones across climate and vegetation. This map of Southern Africa, in the western side of the map in the darker gray, that's an area of winter rainfall, much as what we have here in California. Hot, drier summers, cold, wetter winters. The medium gray in the middle is year-round rainfall, and the lighter gray in the northeast is summer rainfall. And so we can see that the Howissens Port and Steele Bay span all of these ecological zones. And so they do not seem to be, whatever their adaptation provides, whatever signal they're indicating, it doesn't seem to be bound to the environment. And the Howissens Port in particular has a wide geographic distribution. It is the younger of the two industries. The Steele Bay, more narrow geographic distribution in the south, the older of the two industries. But because of the innovation of technology, because of their timing, because of some of the other items of material culture found with them, they've been a focus of documenting this behavioral evolution, this kind of evidence of innovation and connectivity. And we can see that in the examples of the Nacerius shell beads from Blombos Cave, the engraved ochre from Blombos Cave, as providing evidence of symbolism, signaling through ornaments, handling ochre in a special way, engraved ostrich eggshell, and even figurative art in from these time periods at Apollo 11 in southern Namibia. So these are the types of behaviors that we see coming on the scene during these time periods that are pretty well documented at this point. And it seems to indicate that since it's coming into this time period of Howiesen's Port and Still Bay, that these innovations are coming out of periods of population connection across this geographic environmental zone, when these ideas or these populations, we don't know which, are spreading over this large geographic area. However, there is a bias in the placement of these, or the bias in the excavation history and preservational history for Southern Africa towards the humid coast, and also towards the later Stone Age. Because of the distinctiveness of the Howiesen's Port and Still Bay, they have gotten a lot of attention, and yeah, have received a lot of attention, a lot of focus in terms of excavating, trying to figure out what's happening with them. And so my colleagues and I were interested in knowing if there was a bias towards this human coast. Would these innovations be happening elsewhere on this large, diverse continent? And so we identified a region to excavate here in the kind of blue box, the open gap along the southwest coast of South Africa. So we are still within this Southern African knowledge zone where there's a lot of well-documented excavations, well-studied materials, but that are within what's known as the Fynbos biome. And we wanted to go outside of this well-studied region to see if other environmental contexts, what was happening there, particularly more marginal or arid environmental contexts. So we moved a bit further north to the Canasvlekte in southern Namaqualand, South Africa. And we can see this narrow strip of land here that's about less than 100 kilometers wide on the west coast of South Africa, that spans between the Olifants River in the south and the Orange River, which forms the border between South Africa and Namibia in the north. And it is, as we'll see on the next slide, a low-lying quartz graveled plain with shallow drainages, but with uplands to the south and the east. And so it really is, because of this topography, it's in a pretty distinct ecological zone. It's in the succulent Karoo, compared to what's just south in this Cape Floristic region. And so we're close to the other richer environmental zones, but there's some topography that's influencing the environment, as well as geological substrates that's influencing the plants that grow there. So it becomes a marginal arid environment really fast compared to some of the better studied places that are further to the south. So we're in the Canasvlekte. These are these quartz gravel plains that you can see there in the bottom left, these kind of concentrations of gravels depending on the bedrock underneath. It's a veggie feld or shrub land with these xeric adapted, arid adapted succulent shrubs. It's famous for the little stone plants that you can see in the upper left. There's many, many types of these plants that are endemic to the region now. As you can see, though, the succulents do not provide a high plant biomass to support a high animal biomass. So there are definitely larger herds of animals that pass through the region, smaller animals that are staying local to the region, but it is a limited environment and limited to more or less 175 millimeters of rainfall per year, plus some additional moisture brought in by fogs. fog. It is a winter rainfall zone area still, although minimal rainfall. And it's considered a marginal environment, quite dry and also highly seasonal. And you can see that on the right, looking at the changes in the landscape from winter to summer. So much more resource limited in the summer, although there is still some water that runs through, like the Varsche River in the summer, when it rains up in the uplands, and water will flow through the area, but the landscape, aside from the riverbeds, doesn't receive that water and gets quite parched. So here we are on a regional map. We can see on the larger map the aridity index of these more prominent sites excavated in these more humid regions. And we see VR3 there in this more arid environmental zone. So we were wanting to ask, what are the evidence for innovations in this arid region? Are there connections with sites 100 kilometers to the south? And again, what is this relationship between innovation, cultural connectedness, and environmental change and variation? And so in the map, in the inset map, we can see again VR3 in the succulent Karoo, that yellow region. And just moving south, a suite of sites, Elands Bay Cave, Deep Kloof Rock Shelter to the west, and then sites that my colleague Alex Mackay has excavated in the east, Poetslakte 8, Klipfontein Rand, Hollow Rock Shelter, and Mertenhof. And those are only 100 kilometers as the crow flies, but in a very, very distinctive environmental zone. As you can see, those sites all in that green Fynbos zone, where we're up in that yellow succulent Karoo Canastfleckte zone. So I did just want to take a moment here to highlight the large number of colleagues who are contributing to this project. In particular, my co-PI, Alex Mackay from the University of Wollongong. All of this is, deeply shared with him as co-investigator of the project. And our South African collaborator, Jason Orton, who focuses in on the later Stone Age materials that have been excavated at the site, as well as becoming more and more interdisciplinary, bringing in more and more specialists who are helping us with the geoarchaeology, including Vienna's Marika Stahlsmith, our geochronology. For the reasons that we'll outline in this talk, moving forward, we're really investing even more heavily in paleoclimatic reconstructions. We also have some students and former students who've been involved in looking at heat treatment of the silkretes, the pigments, who are helping me with the fauna. And I'll be happy to talk about any of their contributions in more detail, but I just really want to highlight the village that it takes to make a project like this work. All right, so here we can see Varsche Rivier 3 up in this limestone cliff face that is above the bed of the Varsche River. And we can see here in the front, these shrubs in the front are the shrubs that grow in the riverbed because of the more continuing moisture there, a little bit larger shrubs. There is a very large floodplain, which we have not ever seen run. And that's something we're interested in investigating, is when in the past it might have expanded to incorporate this large floodplain. And then there's this limestone cliff face that is actually on either side of the river that has a few rock shelters in it. And underneath the tarps there, that's Varsche Rivier 3, kind of in this amphitheater of the limestone cut. And here we see Varsche Rivier 3 in more detail before we started excavating. In 2009 is when we first went out and explored the region for its archaeological potential. My colleague Jason Orton had been up to that landscape a number of times and had noticed abundant actually stone artifacts that were on the surface, so exposed open air archaeology, and was interested in documenting more of that, but then also that there were these shelters on the landscape. And so we put together a project where 4 of us went out and conducted text excavations of 3 shelters and documenting open air occurrences in 2009. And then we went back for field season in 2011 that focused just on Varsche Rivier with Middle Stone Age research questions in mind. The other 2 shelters that we tested preserved later Stone Age deposits only, and Jason went on to excavate those more fully. And then we had 3 consecutive field seasons in 2014, 15, and 16. And the results that I'm presenting today primarily are coming from those 14, 15, and 16 seasons. And the material I'm presenting on today is coming from the lowest part of the deposits. So they're pre-Still Bay deposits. And they're in this, what we refer to as Sector 1, or the deep sounding, that has a maximum depth right now of 1.9 meters below the surface of this slope right here. And we still have not encountered bedrock in that area, 1.9 meters down. So we'll see how we continue. When we went back out this past season, we didn't continue in that area because we're going to have to do some restructuring to make sure that that stays safe to excavate in that deep sounding. So, but these are the deposits that I'm focusing on today, these lower pre-Still Bay deposits. It appears that this accumulation, these lowest deposits that we've excavated so far accumulated about 92 to 80,000 years ago. And this date is reconstructed from 4 luminescence datings of feldspar by Simon Armitage, and 3 thorium-uranium burial ages of ostrich eggshell reconstructed by Warren Sharp and Elizabeth Nespolo. And they're in, the 2 dating systems are in broad agreement, showing an accumulation in the earlier Middle Stone Age, so pre-Still Bay Middle Stone Age. And one of the things that's identified right away here, so we've got a whole kaleidoscope of colors on this profile. I'll be showing this profile through the next slides and highlighting some things that we've noticed. In these older deposits, there's an increased use of silkrete in that those deposits. So those are plotted in pink there, and then in blue where they're coming from the screens in more detail. So the stone artifacts also support the idea that we're working in the pre-Still Bay, early Middle Stone Age. 42% of the stone artifacts are silkrete coming out of these deposits. 30% are quartz. And this is distinctive from the subsequent deposits that accumulated at the site, where we have ranges about 55 to 65% quartz. And that is maybe not surprising, given that we're in quartz gravel plains. Quartz is not a limited resource. It's a very local resource in this environment. And we do also have silkrete that is local as well. But the silkrete is used significantly less in the younger layers at the site, somewhere between 7 to 16%. However, the stone artifacts are, those retouched artifacts are similar to overlying layers, except for when we get much higher and have Howison support materials, where there's notch flakes and denticulates. They're not particularly descriptive or diagnostic, but they are prepared in small laminar cores, not much bipolar reduction, and pretty much producing opportunistic small flakes and producing small flakes and opportunistic blades with very short reduction chains. So again, this isn't a tool, a stone tool, a tool, raw material, that's the word I'm looking for, raw material limited environment. We have source materials throughout the landscape. And so not surprising that there's short reduction sequences. And although this isn't a particularly distinctive technology, it's a pretty informal technology that hasn't, as far as Alex Mackay, is my colleague, who's the stone tool technologist, hasn't been described anywhere else. So it does seem to be distinctive. What's particularly distinctive about it is the heavy employment of heat treatment on these silkretes. So 95% of all silkrete cores show evidence of heat treatment, and particularly evidence of shatter. And what Alex Mackay and Alex Blackwood have reconstructed for this is that here we're looking at really informal, low investment heat treatment, where basically heat was used to alter and particularly to fragment the stone materials. So heat treatment here, we're just talking about putting rocks in fires. Doesn't look like there's any kind of complex fire technology or anything like that that was used. It does look like it was done on site, but what they were doing was heating the silkrete such that it, as raw material, such that it shattered along the lines of weakness, impurities, fragmented, and then taking those smaller fragments and flaking those. So it was a very expedient way of creating small angular core blanks that were then flaked and flaked without extensive reduction sequences, without real formal shaping of those materials. And so this is also a type of heat treatment that is not documented elsewhere, this very, very expedient shattering, but then into what appeared to be useful bits, desirable bits. From my side, for the vertebrate fauna, we have animals that we would expect for the environment, eland and grayspok, so two extremes of the bovid size classes, something like springbok, some wildebeest, hartebeest, which are grazing animals, zebra. And so all of those do indicate a more grass-rich environment than what we have at the present, in a kind of open, arid to semi-arid landscape. And while not a focus of this talk, but a focus of ongoing research, tortoises are, I don't know, kind of insanely abundant in this assemblage. And so exploring ways in which that might be, tortoises might be heavily relied upon to supplement these larger game resources that might be more limited in this environment. Interestingly, we also have marine mollusks at the site. Not a huge amount, but they are these green dots shown on this Sector 1 profile, this deep profile, and they are clustered in a band in these deeper environments, with a few scattered at the younger deposits. They're mainly limpets, which would be the most interesting resource from this coastline. But the point here is that the modern coast is about 44 kilometers to the west as the crow flies. And so this is pretty, evidence of either transport or, resource movement or people movement to the coastline. This isn't enough shell to have indicated at least a heavy part of the diet being brought back. This seems like it might have been to shells of interest, perhaps used for tools. We don't know. There's no evidence of human modification on the shells, that as far as we can see, but their preservation isn't pristine. But there is then evidence of transport to the coast, or connections with the coast, which is unusual for the Southern African coastline. Although we do see it, interesting enough, we don't see it in the Fynbos region, but we do see evidence of connections to the coast when you move further north. So many more hundreds of kilometers away, but in places like Apollo 11 and Pakkenbank, those inland arid environment sites do also show evidence for the coast, but those better studied, documented, more abundant sites south of us in the Fynbos region, when they're inland, they do not show, in the Middle Stone Age, don't show evidence of connections to the coast. We have abundant ostrich eggshells in the deposits as well. So the ostrich eggs are large. They're about 24 chicken eggs worth of resources. And we see an abundance of them in these deposits, so also seem to be a really important food resource for the people on the landscape. Almost 80% of them are burnt. And so in these lower deposits, we don't have direct evidence of fire hearths in these deposits, but we do have indirect evidence that fires were being produced, being built on these deposits and used for the heat treatment. And then the OES, the ostrich eggshell, is being burnt as well, presumably secondarily as hearths are built over waste materials. But we're further investigating the ostrich eggshell as well. But quite notably, within, again, a band just below and into where the marine shell are, we have 21 pieces of what we reconstructed as worked ostrich eggshell. Basically, they have impact fractures on them that are conchoidal fractures coming from the external surface to the internal surfaces. It also, but seems to be small and therefore intentional, not just a great whack to break open the egg. And with like the pieces that we've illustrated here, you can see that a lot of these worked surfaces, these conchoidal fractures, that they're have been worked into arcs, small arcs. And so we kind of, what if, kind of fantastically, in a fantasy world, reconstructed some of them virtually with the photos to produce what seems to be an aperture, a hypothetical fit of some of these pieces into apertures that closely resemble the ethnographic materials that are housed in the South African Museum that were used as flasks. So we've put forward the argument in the manuscript that I'm drawing this talk from, put forward this argument of it's worked ostrich eggshell. We don't have much evidence for working in this way. Wouldn't it be cool if they were flask mouths in this arid environment and early water storage or transport innovation at these early time periods in this resource limited environment? But this was going to be very hard to demonstrate because we also have actualistic studies of feeding ostrich, Andrew Candella's feeding, or no, feeding ostrich eggs to hyenas and looking at the tooth marks and things like that. So trying to demonstrate flask mouths was going to be more challenging. But finally, we did have a field season this past 2024 when we could actually access the collections again after many pandemic and family delays. And we were able to actually go back to these pieces and in fact find a refit within our excavated material. And so this is not even hot off the presses because it's not published yet, but this is what we were identifying in July when we were back in the field. So we do have a refit between two of these fragments that makes a much more convincing and fuller arc that we may be dealing with flask mouths here at 80, 90,000 years ago and water transport. So what does all of this mean? What is the significance of all of this? As we're building the paleo-environmental component of our project, we did have a student go through, a supervised student, not by me, going through samples of phytoliths from the deposits. And what they have reconstructed is that the lower deposits, so highlighted here on the left side of the screen, the lower deposits had more C4 or warm-loving grasses. And we can see that in these figures. So this indicated in these lower deposits where we have these innovations happening, that we're dealing with warmer environments with more summer rainfall, weaker winter rainfall. And as we transition into the higher deposits that aren't the focus of what we've been talking about today, we see a transition to more woody and shrubby vegetation, more C3 or cool weather grasses, so cooler weather with less summer rainfall, and a stronger winter rainfall. So signal that's becoming much more like the present in those upper deposits where those lower deposits are distinctive. And so what we've reconstructed is that during this time period, VR3 was isolated and showing adaptations and innovations that were distinct from sites only 100 kilometers to the south. That we have distinct stone tool industries that incorporating heat treatment, heavy and silkcrete use, the innovation of flask mouths, transportation of marine mollusks. All of that's happening up at VR3 when comparably aged deposits 100 kilometers to the south in this Feinboss region, they were not participating in those behaviors. So as we move through to the younger deposits at VR3, we do have a flickering of still bay and pretty I don't know if solid is the right word, distinctive Howiesensport deposits in the younger layers at VR3. So subsequently, associated with this environmental change, VR3 is integrated into this kind of regional phenomenon of having still bay and Howiesensport industries. And we actually have open air bifacial point site nearby, Soetfontein 1. We can't date it to say for sure it's still bay, but it's consistent with still bay phenomenon. So we know still bay is in the region. We know Howiesensport is in the region. And VR3, with this climatic change, becomes kind of enveloped within this Southern African region of exchange. So what we see is actually something that's a little bit different than what people have argued in the past, that it's in this period of isolation that we see a lot of innovation in the record here. And then we see connections coming subsequently in the Still Bay and Howiesensport. And so this really contributes to or pushes on questions of in what context do innovations occur, and in what context do they spread? And so there's been arguments that innovations occur in larger populations where you have, more brains putting things together, more ideas, more communication, more models to follow, and that's when it spreads. But here in this example, we seem to have an isolated population that was innovating, although we don't yet know how those innovations may have spread, if at all. At that moment, we don't see them spreading across the mountains further south, but we do see some similarities with people who are in similar environments up further north, like I said, at Apollo 11 and Paken Bank. So what's the significance here? So these deposits were occupied 92 to 80,000 years ago in the early Middle Stone Age. So we're getting an idea of what's happening pre-Still Bay. And we see a complex of innovations that are local adaptations to a distinct environment. And as we said, there's novel lithic technology that's based on the reduction of small silkrete fragments. Those silkrete fragments were produced by low investment heat treatment. We see the transport of marine shells for more than 44 kilometers. That's from the modern coast. We don't think there's not a long continental shelf there. So we don't know exactly how far out the sea levels might have been 92 to 80 years ago, probably not extremely different. We're not on the southern coast. And we see worked ostrich eggshell that now we actually feel more comfortable saying, more confident arguing that they're flasks. And this is different from what's seen in other parts of Southern Africa, but then connections do develop with the Steele Bay and Huisens port with subsequent environmental change. And so we do see complexity, diversity within this Southern African record that is based on our data, dependent on local environments and the trajectories of those local environments and patterns of innovation and cultural transmission. To step back for a moment, so what does this mean for all of Africa, modern humans originating in Africa? And it's these kinds of data that we can start putting together about what of these behaviors that we typically take as complex or symbolic, when and where are they happening across the continent. And we do see ochre use used quite widely across all the geographic regions. Documented in northern and southern Africa, we see shells as objects of interest that are getting transported across the environment and used as ornaments. We see the extensive use of fire. That doesn't mean it wasn't happening elsewhere, but this is where we've got preservation and identification of it. In the north only, though, do we have the widespread and persistent interest in ornamental shells, tick shells that are similar to what I showed for Southern Africa, but occurring 120,000 years ago over a pretty wide geographic region from Northwest Africa across to some examples found in the Eastern Mediterranean. Only in the south right now, though, do we have engraved ochre and engraved ostrich eggshell. In the south and east, we have quite early evidence for ostrich eggshell beads, and we're trying to, us and colleagues, get a grasp on just how early those ostrich eggshell beads start appearing. And there we can definitely talk about persistent technologies. And we see evidence of long distance transport on the scale of 100 kilometers in North Africa, 300 kilometers in East Africa. And we don't see evidence for that long of a distance transport in Southern Africa. So for now, we're trying to pull together patterns, document patterns at a regional scale, look at them at a larger scale, and going back and forth between those scales, with the argument that we need to develop well-defined and specific models. What do we really mean when we're talking about connections? Are we talking about from Southern Africa on the western side to the eastern side? Are we talking about South Africa up into East Africa? To really be more definitive about what we're saying. And so use the information like what I just showed on the previous slide to talk about population isolation and connection to test these models. And that's really important for us as archaeologists to more formally put out there, particularly when colleagues, say, working in human genetics are developing their models, where they're looking at periods of, or finding evidence for periods of integration between different regional populations. Do we see archaeological evidence? So arguing to further refine the timing with a regional approach, and of course, it is a story of human evolution as whole individuals. It needs to be well integrated with human paleontology and genetics, although we also know that we're talking about behavioral phenomenon that can travel without genetic boundaries, but just to make sure that the lines of evidence are supporting a similar picture, and increasing importance of local paleoecology, what's happening locally that's impacting those those ancestors on the landscape and not just at a larger global scale. Because particularly like working in Southern Africa, we see differences in how, say, glacial periods were manifested, whether you're in the winter rainfall zone or the summer rainfall zone. We can't just talk about glacial periods. We need more, like so many places in the world, we need more on the ground, local paleoenvironmental reconstructions. All right, and this project was also not possible without a lot of financial support from these organizations, a lot of fieldwork support from the heritage agencies in granting us permits from the landowners who allowed us to access the land, from the University of Cape Town, who provides research facilities and equipment, from the Archaeology Contract Office's associates and Asia Consulting, and other colleagues and families who have supported us. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.